Let's talk about everything that I read in June and July. Hello, my name is Emily Crow from The Cozy Crow and welcome to my YouTube channel. And we did skip last month because I was not feeling well the week I was going to film. So I gave myself some grace and some time to just rest and get better. I'm feeling a lot better now, and I would love to chat with you today about everything that I read in the months of June and July, since we are catching up a little bit. We're gonna start off this video by talking about different statistics, both for June and July separately, because that's how I normally do my videos. But in total, I did read 19 books over the past 2 months, which is quite a lot. And I have been pretty slumpy, but I've just been, again, giving myself grace and just reading what sounds good and just trying to enjoy reading when I can. So let's talk about June first. So when we look at all the books I read in June, I read 8 total books. I read 7 of them via audiobook and I read 1 of them physically. No ebooks to be had there. And then as far as the genre goes, I read 3 romances, I read 2 fantasies, and then I read 1 each of science fiction, horror, and a magical realism, which is kind of more of a subgenre, but it just doesn't really fit into general fiction or into fantasy. If we want to look at when these books were published, I like to see how current my reading is versus what I'm going through backlists to read. So I read 3 books that were published in 2025, 2 books published in 2024, 2 books published in the early 2020s, and then I read 1 outlier that was published in the 1950s. This was published in 1954, and that was my oldest book, and it was The Two Towers by Tolkien. The longest book I read was Shield of Sparrows, which was 511 pages, and that book is by Devney. It's her first romantasy. And then the shortest book I read was Fugitive Telemetry by Martha Wells. That's part of the Murderbot series, and that was only 168 pages. I love a good novella. My average star rating was not great. It was 3.56 stars. I had lots of lower reads. It's definitely a bell curve. Lots of mediocre and low reads in the month of June. I did have 1 5-star, and that was my Murderbot book. And I had 1 2.25 star read, and that'll be the very first book when I tell you about everything I read in June. Oof, 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 oof. When we look at my overall goals for the year 2025, I got 4 books off of my physical TBR, which gives me a total net for the month of -1. So I'm making progress. My overall goal is to have a net negative for the books I bring in versus the books I get off of my TBR. So making progress there. I read 1 book whose author was a person of color. I read 1 classic, and then I did not get any books off of my 25 and 2025 physical TBR list. That's a specific list I want to prioritize. And then I didn't have any rereads for the month of June either. So that's June. A little bit slumpy. And then in July, things were looking up a little bit, but not quite back to the level of book consumption that I was at previously. So in July, I read 11 books. I read 9 of them on audio. Again, par for the course for me. I read 1 ebook, and then I read 1 physical book. When we look at the genres that I read in July, I read 3 fantasies, 2 romances, 2 nonfictions, a little bit different for me. I read 2 dystopian or sci-fi novels, and then I read 1 general fiction and 1 mystery. I ended up hitting my 100th book of the year in the month of July, so that was pretty exciting to realize that. I do not have an overall goal for total books I want to read this year. I'm just trying to go with the flow and focus more on my smaller goals of getting more BIPOC authors, getting more classics, getting certain books. Hi, Alfred. Getting certain books off my TBR. Let's look at when books were published. So I read 3 books published in 2025, 3 books published in 2024, 1 book published in the early 2020s, 1 book published in the 2010s, 1 book published in the early 2000s, and then I read, again, another outlier. This is my classic of the month. In the 1940s, I read 1 book. And this book was published in 1949, and that was George Orwell's 1984. I read 1 reread in the month, which was, again, George Orwell's 1984. I read that first in high school. The longest book that I read was A Harvest of Hearts by Andrea Eames, and that was 428 pages, so nothing too crazy in the month of July. And then the shortest book I read was Binti by Nnedi Okorafor, and that was 90 pages. And actually, they are a professor at UB, University of Buffalo, a SUNY school that is near where I grew up. So that was kind of fun, a little nod to my hometown. Star ratings. I did not have any 5 stars this month, but my lowest rating was a 3.75. So overall, a pretty good month. My average star rating was 4.05. And then looking at my overall goals for the year, I got 6 books off of my physical TBR, leaving me with a net negative 2 books for the month. So again, making good progress on my total goal to have fewer books on my TBR at the end of the year versus the beginning of the year. I read 1 book by a person of color, and I read 1 classic, and I had 1 reread. I did not get any books off of my 25 and 2025 physical TBR list. Again, I just wasn't feeling it. I tried to get some books from my library to listen to, and I'm just waiting for a few holds. So I should be getting through a couple more books in the month of August to kind of get me back on track with that. But I was pretty par for the course until June, July. So I think I can catch up pretty quick. All right, so those are all of my statistics for the past couple months. If you have any specific questions for the types of books that I read, or any statistics you want to know, let me know down below, because I would love to do some more digging and do some more number crunching for you if that's something you're interested in. So let me know if you want to hear more from me. Let's jump into our stack of books that we read in the month of June. The first book that I finished in June was my least favorite book in this 2-month stretch, and it was Shield of Sparrows by Devney. I think I'm just not a popular romantic girly. I just need more substance in my reads. And this book was just really frustrating because Odessa's the main character. She is the second princess in this family, and she's just kind of fine with her mediocre life, just kind of plugging along, when she is surprised to be married off to another kingdom when it was supposed to be her sister all along. Her sister was preparing to be a spy and, was very capable in terms of politics and that kind of like spy type stuff. And Odessa is just not competent at all. And she is made to go to this other kingdom where there's lots of secrets, and her father wants her to learn some things and share her knowledge. She's just not prepared. But not only is she not prepared, like I said, she's not competent. She has no redeeming qualities. She has no skills. There's nothing that really sets her apart or makes her interesting or likable, even someone you can really root for. She was just really frustrating to read about. I just was not enjoying anything about her character, honestly. And then the book was really long, and it felt so slow because it felt like Odessa had so many questions, but she didn't get any answers because all of her questions were internal. And so the first half of the book moved so slowly. And there were some twists and turns. I will give this book that much credit, but a lot of them were pretty predictable. So not super exciting. I liked the ending. It was very gritty and honestly like very destructive and caught me off guard. And so I liked that. And I wish the whole book had that feeling of it. I might end up reading the second book. I don't know if this is going to be duology or trilogy or what, but I might continue reading just because of that ending. And I really liked the premise of the plot with the secrets going on in this world. There were some monsters and sickness with some of these monsters. So I really liked that part of the plot, and I just did not get a lot of that because this was romantasy and much more focused on the romance. But the romance didn't move anywhere either. I felt like Odessa and the Guardian, clearly they're the romance. Like, I'm not spoiling anything, but they just hated each other. And the only reason I can see that they ended up having a romance is because they found each other hot. Like, I didn't see, again, any redeeming qualities in Odessa or any reason why anyone would like her. I don't know. I could not get on board, and I kind of hate finished it. And then I actually kind of liked the ending because there was death and destruction and some gore. I loved that part. Sorry, my cat is freaking out over there. There was death and destruction and gore, and I really liked that part of the book, honestly. So if they have more of that in future books, I might end up reading. It's so sad because I feel like a bunch of these romantasy books are really hyped up. They have beautiful stenciled edges, and so you really want to grab this book, especially because everyone's talking about it, and they're just not good. The writing is not good. The storytelling is not good, and it feels like a waste. of a book. I'm glad I did not purchase this. I was able to get it from my library as an audiobook first, and I definitely will not be purchasing any books in the series. And this makes me not want to read any romances by Devney Perry either, because I just don't know how much substance they'll have. Okay, Alfred, you're getting a timeout. You're being too loud. So yes, this was my 2.25 star. Did not like, would not recommend. But I had a couple of redeeming qualities. The next book that I read, again, I listened to it on audio, was The Sirens by Emilia Hart. And I rated this a 3.75 star. It was a solid read. There were things I liked, also things I feel like were not executed as well. This is a magical realism type story that is founded in like mermaid lore. And just like her other book, Wayward, it has multiple points of view from different time periods. So you get historical, you get present day, and as the present day people are kind of learning more about their past and their heritage in this magical realism sense, you're also seeing connections with the past and in their ancestry. So I really like that structure of the story. I did feel like this book felt more like a family drama and was lacking a little bit on the magical realism and the really leaning into that like mermaid lore that was alluded to in the story. And I really loved the historical aspect because it included a lot more of that. I feel like it leaned more into that magical realism direction. I also would have loved, because there was definitely a sense of like female empowerment and vigilante justice. I wish there was more of that, especially in the present day. I don't know, I just liked that feeling of chaos and like vigilante justice sense. And so I wanted more of that. I wanted more of the magical realism. And I also wanted more closure from the drama that we hear at the very beginning of the story, where our main character wakes up and finds herself strangling her boyfriend, lover. I don't know how exclusive they were. It was a little bit vague about that, but she wakes up strangling him and she doesn't know why that happened or how that happened. So she runs away, not very smart anyway, and she goes to visit her sister as a way to kind of get out of the environment that she was in and kind of figure out what's happening, because she's like, wait, doesn't my sister sleepwalk too? So maybe she knows something about that, and then she can't find her sister at first. So she's learning more about her sister and this place that she went to. It's set in Australia, so that was a really cool setting to be in, and I would love to learn more about the lore and history of Australia in this sense. So I thought there were things that were intriguing and kept me interested, but it just didn't quite fulfill in the way that I was hoping for. The next book that I read was Pride and Protest by Nikki Payne. And this book, I rated a 3.25 star. It just didn't quite engage me or hook me like I was hoping for. And I feel kind of that way about a lot of these Austen retellings that I read recently. And while I liked the premise that our Lizzie type character was trying to fight the gentrification of her neighborhood, and that the Darcy type character was part of the capitalist conglomerate that was trying to take over her neighborhood and buy it out and bulldoze and put in some like high-rise apartments and businesses and whatnot. So I liked that idea. I just did not like how this was executed. I don't know. I feel like there was a lot of dissonance in the plot and the way the story went. I feel like some things made sense and some things really didn't make sense, and the author only threw them into the story as a way to connect with the original Pride and Prejudice. That like some of them felt very intentional and altered purposefully to fit this story, and some things just didn't quite fit right. I also felt like the characters too were just kind of a mismatch between modern day, and they would be speaking kind of crassly, honestly, and then in the same conversation they would start quoting Jane Austen. It just felt really weird in that kind of dissonance. Like I said, I couldn't really get behind these characters. I didn't really connect with them a ton. Nothing superbly wrong with it. I just was a little bit indifferent about these characters, and I wish I could have seen more of like the political nature and capitalist nature of this issue at hand, because I thought that was a really interesting take and a really prevalent take for our day and age. I also felt like these characters were like kind of too horny, very lustful, and I don't know, that dynamic was like not doing it for me. I don't prefer spicy for the sake of spicy. I like having an emotional connection between the love interest. I don't mind spice if it is connected with their emotions and the expansion of the relationship. But this book felt a little bit too lusty for me, if that makes sense. So I don't know, like I feel like there was some promise there, but the way this was executed was not quite right. Maybe I would even lower the rating from like a 3.25 to like a 3-star because it was all right. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend it, but I'm not necessarily mad that I read it either. The next book that I read, wow, I got through a lot of audiobooks that I don't have physical copies of at the beginning of my month. I read So Thirsty by Rachel Harrison, and while I really liked Cackle by her, that was the first book I read by hers, and I enjoyed that one. Every book I've read since then by hers has just been worse and worse. So I don't know if maybe she's just not the right author for me, but I rated this a 2.75 star. I did not like this book. It is a vampire story. You get to meet Sloane, our main character. She's very unlikable. She also has very low self-esteem. Her husband has cheated on her multiple times, and she's just kind of whatever about it. She's just like hanging out. She's like, fine, whatever, that's just how it is. My life sucks. I'm aging, even though she's only like 30. She's very dramatic. She goes on like a weekend retreat with her best friend, who is a very outgoing, rambunctious type of a person. And you're like 40% of the way into this book when you finally meet the vampires, which felt really slow. And then, of course, it's a vampire story. They turn, they're navigating their life. I don't know. Sloane just made me so annoyed like the whole time because she just didn't make sense. She was so logical in some ways that it didn't make sense. And then she was so illogical in other ways it didn't make sense. And every choice she made was the opposite of what I would have done. And it was just so frustrating to hear about. And she did have some character growth throughout the story, but it was only some. And I would have loved more growth in her. But maybe that was unrealistic to expect. But there was also a romance, and I just didn't see any redeeming qualities in her. And I don't know, bothered by her obsession with aging and wrinkles and stuff when she was only 30. I'm 30. Like, I know I'm getting older. I've got aches and pains. I don't feel as fit as I did when I was in college, but like, I'm not obsessing about it. I just was bothered by Sloane so much. And while there were some good themes kind of sprinkled into this story, I feel like none of them were fleshed out, and our main character Sloane took away and distracted from those themes that could have been talked about and discussed a little bit more. So there's some interesting like moral quandaries towards the end of the story, and yeah, I just wanted a little bit more weight to that and less Sloane. The next book that I read was Fugitive Telemetry by Martha Wells. This is part of the Murderbot series. I just love Murderbot, and I love a good novella. This book was my 5-star read, and it got me out of my reading slump. It got me excited to read again. I was trying to stay up late to read more of this. I was excited to get into bed and read this before I went to sleep. Like, it was perfect. It was exactly what I needed. But I'm trying to pace myself and not read all of the Murderbot series super speedy because I'm loving it so much. So I'm trying to kind of sprinkle it in as I need a palate cleanser. In this story, Murderbot is back on Preservation Station, and there has been a murder. So there's like a mystery going on as they're trying to figure out the story of like how this murder happened or what happened. Because Preservation is such a utopian, calm, and safe type of a place that a murder is like totally out there. And while they are trying to solve this murder, Murderbot is also trying to kind of find their place, as there's some prejudices against them for being a rogue sec unit. And they're trying to balance those considerations with their role in protecting the humans that they care about and things like that. So I've seen a lot of growth in Murderbot in the series, but especially in this book, I love the mystery in the plot. And this book was just exactly what I needed in the moment. So highly recommend. Think there's 4 novellas and then a full-length novel. And then there's this novella and then another book that is kind of like a full-length novel. It might be a short full-length novel. And I know that there's a couple other books in the works, but the author, Martha Wells, has cancer. And so that's her focus right now. So who knows when we'll get other Murderbot books. I hope that Martha Wells is doing well and healing and taking care of herself, and that we do get some books eventually. But until then, I am slowly going through this series. Another book that I thought would get me out of the reading slump, but didn't quite do it for me, but was one of my favorites of the month. This is Great Big Beautiful Life by Emily Henry, and I rated this a 4.5 star. I say it's a favorite of mine. I did really enjoy it, but it was one of my least favorite Emily Henry books. It just didn't quite hit like her other books did. In this story, you follow two writers who are kind of competing for writing a memoir, writing a biography for this socialite, I guess, or someone who was in the social scene decades ago and kind of disappeared for a few decades. And so you're kind of looking back on her life and learning more about her history and her life, and they're trying to convince her that they are the right writer for the job. And so this book is kind of half and half, like the mystery of like her history and the choices that she made and what led her to even step away from the limelight, and these two writers and how they get to know each other and gain each other's trust and have a romance with one another. So while I liked both aspects of this story, I feel like neither of them was totally fleshed out the way that I would have liked. I feel like the historical aspect, Margaret's point of view, there was way too much old history about like her great grandfather and things like that that were just not pertinent to the story. And I just wanted more details and feeling about her choices and what she did, because it felt like she was only in the limelight briefly before she kind of ended her story that she was telling to the writers. While I loved the romance between these two characters, it felt like slightly insta-lovey, like things just happened kind of quick for them, though I really loved their chemistry and their banter and how they got along. I loved how these characters were really understanding of one another and how their relationship as it progressed was influencing their relationship with Margaret too. There were some twists towards the end that were kind of predictable. In some ways they were not as predictable, you know, complex twists that had multiple layers to them, I guess, if that makes sense. But I just wanted more. And this book was like a pretty sizable book. It wasn't superbly huge, but I feel like 50 to 100 more pages would have really cushioned both parts of these stories and helped with the balance a little bit, so I would have enjoyed both parts a little bit more. Because yeah, I just feel like they were lacking a little bit, both the historical Margaret's point of view and the writer's current day point of view. I just wanted more. And the conclusion was also a little bit lacking for me. So again, not my favorite, but not my least favorite. I think my least favorite, it's kind of in the same realm as Funny Story. Like, not my favorite, definitely wanted more from this story, but I enjoyed it overall. Definitely had some heartwarming moments that really hit me in the feels. I love Emily Henry's writing style, but this one just didn't quite do it for me the same way that others of hers have. One of my goals for this year is to read the Lord of the Rings series, as well as just reading more classics in general, but I've never read the Lord of the Rings trilogy. 6 books, 3 books, however you want to describe it. The Lord of the Rings saga, perhaps. I read The Fellowship a month or 2 ago, and I finally got to The Two Towers by Tolkien, and this book was really slow. I've been reading this while also watching the movie with my husband in increments. We're doing the extended editions, so they take a really long time, and we're just doing it in small pieces, but the movie is way better. The balance is just a lot better because the first half of this book didn't even talk about Frodo and the ring. It was just about everybody else. So I felt like I kept waiting for something to happen. And the way that the movie is, it just kind of switches between the two timelines a lot better. Whereas this is like one book for one timeline and one book for another timeline. It also felt so slow at certain parts that it was just kind of a drag a little bit to get through. In general, I feel like the pacing was not as good. And while I had a little bit of issues with the pacing for The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers was way worse as far as pacing goes, and just had lots of really slow moments, and the story didn't keep moving along like I would have hoped. So I'm really excited to see how The Return of the King goes as I read that, and things are kind of ramping up, especially because we've already started watching that movie. So hopefully I will read it soon. I rated this a 3.75 star. The last book that I read in June was The Geographer's Guide to Romance by Andrea Holton, and this was the second book in the series. I really enjoyed the first book. This book just fell short for me. Where to start? I rated this a 3.25 star. I liked how there was a lot more magic involved with what the geographers were doing and in the plot of the story. It didn't feel like random magical birds just thrown in, but it felt like the whole story was infused with magic. So I liked that, though I felt like the magic was a lot more complicated and hard to follow, and I got confused a lot by reading this book. It was really hard to figure out what was going on and what these characters were saying and what was making them choose to do the things that they wanted to do. I don't know, it just felt like it went way above my head, which doesn't usually happen. And while I do admit that I'm still kind of in a reading slump, and so that could have contributed, I feel like also the way that this is written and the focus of the author were just not as readable as the first book. And while I liked these two characters, I could not get behind their romance as much. It just felt like they had like a marriage of convenience, and then they split right away, and then they were pining for each other the whole time after that, and it just didn't make sense. It just didn't quite line up for me. So while there was really good tension in this relationship, the basis for that tension, or like the history behind these characters, just didn't give enough weight to that tension. I don't know, it just felt like the tension came out of nowhere. So I wish that their backstory and history had a little bit more oomph to it so that I could have gotten behind the second chance romance of it. I just wasn't getting the history part of their history in the second chance romance. I also feel like there was quite a bit of miscommunication, which is always a hard trope to read about. But eventually they got there, I guess, and started talking to each other. So I definitely did not like this book as much as the first book in the series. I will definitely keep reading if there are more books in the series, but this one just was not it for me. I have somewhere to be, so I have to pause this and I'll have to come back. We'll see if I can get through in the evening. It'll be fun. Maybe I should turn on this lamp, but I have somewhere to be, so I'm gonna go take care of that. And we'll come back and talk about my July reads in a little bit. Hopefully still today, depending on lighting and timing and whatnot. Let's jump into the future for the next portion of this video. All right, we are back and we're gonna talk about July now. Lighting is weird, but I closed all the blinds because the sun's going down. It's after bedtime for my daughter, so you can see my new lamp all lit up. So cute. So let's talk about everything that I read in July. The first book I want to talk about is A Fate Inked in Blood by Danielle Jensen. And I started reading the Bridge Kingdom series and I really liked the first book. I just have not continued in the series. I think just, even though it's in sets of duologies, I just have hesitated to continue reading because it is kind of a longer series and I feel like I have to gear myself up. Anyway, that's not here nor there. A Fate Inked in Blood is another series that recently came out by this author, and it is Norse inspired, which is really cool. I also love these like metallic sprayed edges, and my impression is that this is also a duology. I purchased the second book already, so I have the matching set. A Curse Carved in Bone, maybe? What I really like about this story is that it's Norse inspired. There's some really interesting things with the magic system and the pantheon of gods, because I really don't know a lot about Norse mythology. So I wish there was a little bit more of that stuff, but I just found it really, really fascinating. And while I didn't mind the romance, there was nothing superbly amazing or cringy. It was just kind of fine, good, I guess. Like, I had no issues with it, but also nothing really stood out in that romance. I really liked Freya's character and the struggles that she faces. This is a romantasy, and a lot of them follow a similar formula. So I feel like if you want to base this book off of just romances or just fantasies, you wouldn't rate this as high. I rated it a 4.25 star, maybe a little high just because I was having fun with it. But when you take into consideration how this author followed the romantasy formula, I liked how it turned out. I like how Freya faces a lot of misogyny and systemic issues in her culture that kind of shaped who she is and also continue to shape the direction that her life is going, especially with the magic that comes out into play and just feeling like she doesn't have a lot of control over her situation because of the cultural implications of her position, which I find really interesting and different than a lot of romantasies when they have struggles that the female main character takes. So that's what I liked about this. Like I said, the romance was fine. I had no big issues with it, though And I saw this in the Bridge Kingdom too. I saw where this story was going from a mile away. Like the big twist at the end was super predictable and foreshadowed strongly throughout like the second half of the book. I knew it was coming. And so it really didn't surprise me. So that was not as good, though it definitely still kept me hooked, but it wasn't exciting or new or surprising in that sense. The next book that I read was A Harvest of Hearts by Andrea Eames. Look at these really cute stenciled edges. So fun. Got Cornelius the cat right there. That's really what caught my eye and why I purchased this book in the first place. It says that it is not quite a retelling of Howl's Moving Castle, but definitely pays homage to it. And it says it is a whimsical and unforgettable story of fantastic adventures, common sense, and the power of love to overcome the greatest of obstacles. That got me. But that description does not fit this book. I did still enjoy it. I rated this a 3.75 star. I don't know, there were just some things that worked well for me and some things that didn't work quite as well. I think just expecting this book to be a Howl's Moving Castle with lots of whimsy, it was portrayed as like a cozy vibe, and it was not any of those things. I mean, at the very beginning of the story, you definitely get some allusions to Howl's Moving Castle. The female main character, Foss, is snagged by the heart magic of a sorcerer. And so she travels from her little village all the way to the big city to find the sorcerer that had snagged her heart. And so she goes to his castle and she volunteers to be his housekeeper as a way to kind of hopefully find her heart or figure out how to fix her heart being snagged kind of situation. And so that premise sounds like Howl's Moving Castle or fairly similar to it, but it really felt different. It was much more sober. It honestly was a more gory story, especially the way that the magic worked with snagging the hearts. It definitely evolved to be a lot more gory and grotesque the farther along in the story, and as you got front row seats to how the magic was actually happening, it definitely was not whimsical. It also had more of a melancholic feel to it, and I think part of that is because Foss's character, as we see the story mainly through her eyes, she's a much more sober character. She's the daughter of a butcher. She doesn't think she's very pretty. She is blamed for her mother's death when she was a baby, and so she's just cursed, unwanted by most, and just kind of there, kind of like a, you know, she's an NPC type of character. Yeah, I just feel like the marketing for this book does not coincide with what this book actually was. I did like how, other than the very beginning of the story that felt like Howl's Moving Castle, the majority of this story, I had no idea what was happening next. And so it really kept me hooked in that sense that I just did not know where the story was going. It felt very original and unique in the way the magic was and the relationships of the people, and as secrets were coming out. And I wouldn't necessarily say like plot twists and turns, but more, there was a lot of mysteries that Foss and Sylvester were trying to solve, and things were coming out throughout the story, and they were learning more and more about the magic and what the king's plans were and what the sorceresses were doing, etc., etc. So I liked that, though it did make it hard to feel compelled to keep reading when I really didn't know what was going to happen next, because it wasn't a fast moving book at all. It was definitely more on the slower pace. I think if it was a faster moving book with that aspect of just not knowing what's happening next, it could have moved a lot faster, but it was definitely more slow. I also felt like the relationship between Sylvester the sorcerer and Foss, I don't know, I was just like not convinced of it. I kind of feel like I would have liked the story even more without that romance. Like I didn't feel like the romance was adding to the story or the plot or even to the characterizations. And honestly, Sylvester was not a super layered character. I would have loved more about him as well. Though I did really like Foss and her insecurities and her imperfections, but also her strengths. I don't know, you saw a lot of who Foss was, and I really liked seeing her as a non-traditional protagonist, but someone that was still kind of relatable, though definitely unique and not someone I totally relate to. So I liked that balance there. I did love Cornelius the cat. He's a talking cat, and he was probably one of my favorite parts of this book. He was such a vibe, and I loved hearing him interact with these characters. So that was really sweet. I really liked that part of the story. Overall, I feel like this book was kind of long, and yet some parts of the story and the world building felt a little bit like they fell short, like they didn't give me what I wanted. And some parts felt like they were plenty fleshed out. So I kind of wanted a little bit more balance in the pacing and what the story was trying to do. I'm sorry, you had a bad dream. Do you want to talk about it?
No.
You just wanted some snuggles?
Yeah. Oh, I'm in.
Guess what? You're not supposed to be in the video because you're supposed to be sleeping. Okay, we are done with that hiatus. Hopefully my daughter is actually back in bed for real this time. But the next book that I read was called The Nightmare Before Kissmas by Sara Raasch. And this book is an interesting blend of, it's definitely a romance, but there's a strong fantasy subplot. So these main characters are princes of different holidays, is kind of how it's set up. So Cole is the oldest prince of Christmas, and Hex is the prince of Halloween. These holiday royalty type characters kind of interact and have friendships and travel to visit one another and go to different events together and things like that. It's kind of how this world is set up. But this is a low fantasy, like set in the real world. So there's the special magical realms, and then there's everybody else who is regular that we don't really see a lot of in this story, but they are there. This was such a fun read. I rated this a 3.75 star. It was just a really fun, fast-paced romance that involved these two princes, and it also had this overarching plot as they are preparing for the Christmas season. And there's an arranged marriage that is impending that people are trying to get around, and there seems to be some struggle with joy for Christmas and trying to get, enough joy to go around. And there's some not quite sinister plot, but there's like a plot happening that might be detrimental for Christmas or for the spirit of Christmas in general. And so there's these plot points going on that are totally removed from the romance at hand. So that was really fun and just kept the story really interesting and just different the whole time to read. I know the second book has since come out, so I will probably read that one too. Like I said, this involves Cole and Hex. And first you see their meet cute in like the alley of a bar, and I just was not on board with it. It was just very insta-lovey, and Hex said something mildly inspiring that Cole could not forget, that was so meaningful for him. And I just was very indifferent about that whole interaction. I was just whatever. So that wasn't for me, that's fine. But I really like seeing these characters and how they got to know each other. There was a lot of buildup. And so while they were kind of insta-lovey and while they were also kind of horny, I feel like we only got a couple spicy scenes, and there was a lot of lead up to the spicy scenes, which I appreciated. This felt kind of similar to Red, White, and Royal Blue, except not nearly as spicy as Red, White, and Royal Blue. So I appreciated that because there was a lot more buildup and tension and emotion behind the spicy scenes in general. The actual plot of something happening with the Christmas season and this arranged marriage and whatnot, all of that was, I don't know, very superficial, nothing too deep. And the solutions to these problems ended up being really superficial and not deep as well. So it was just a fun time, not necessarily super meaningful or anything, but I definitely will look forward to reading the next book and potentially reading more from this author too, just to kind of see what else they may put out there into the world. But it was just a fun read, a nice palate cleanser, and I wanted to read more queer stories since I really didn't get a chance to read any in June, and that was mostly because of my slump. So I just wanted to make sure that I read a little bit more from queer voices. The next book that I read was an audiobook that was actually really quick, and I read this as part of the, sister-in-law and mother-in-law book club that we have going on in my husband's side of the family. And so this is called The Day the World Came to Town. This is by DeFede, and it is a nonfiction written pretty soon after 9/11, where we take a look at the individuals that were involved in my gosh, how do I want to say this? 9/11 airspace was shut down in the US. So international flights were not allowed to come into the US when this happened. So they were diverted to other airports in other countries, even some really, really small ones, because they just needed to bring the planes down. They needed to reroute everybody. It was a huge logistical nightmare. And so there were, I don't know, like 35 or something planes that had to land in this little town of Gander, Newfoundland. So you hear from the perspectives of people on the planes, people in Gander and surrounding areas as they are adjusting to the knowledge of 9/11 and how it altered their perception of safety and of what was possible for terrorism, as well as looking at all of the ways that the people of Gander just treated these layaways as someone that was part of the family, and they were just so welcoming and giving to them. And so it really restores your sense of humanity. This was a really interesting story that I didn't know about. I really don't know a ton of history behind 9/11. And I think part of that is just because it's happened in my lifetime. I was in first grade when it happened, and so I've spent a lot of time hearing about it, but I haven't really dug deep into a lot of what actually happened. So this book made me want to do that and learn more about the logistics and the infrastructure and kind of what was happening in the moment, because that was the most exciting thing and the most interesting thing for me as I was reading this book. It just was so fascinating to read that part of the nonfiction. And then after we kind of learn about what is happening with 9/11, we move on to hearing these stories of these people, where the first couple days are really intriguing as people are coming to terms with what's happening. Everyone's choosing like different paths of how to cope and I guess how to fill their time as they are in limbo like this. But then the last like 30% of the book felt kind of boring because it was just the last couple days where everyone was in a groove and nothing was really changing. They were just kind of waiting to be able to get back. And so I definitely like the first half of this book more than the second half of the book. But overall, I just want to learn more about 9/11 from like an academic standpoint, since I haven't really given myself the chance to do that yet. And so this was really interesting to kind of start that conversation and start me thinking about disaster preparedness and the 9/11 experience and how it impacted the world's view on terrorism and safety and all things like that. So really interesting to start thinking about those things, and I want to read more in other spaces about that. I rated this a 4-star. I feel like this author did a good job at collecting these stories and plopping them into the book, but didn't have as much like thread throughout the story or as much compelling me towards the end of the book. I felt like it was a lot of quotations and sharing of stories without a lot of reflection or deeper meaning from the author themselves, even for like an extension of like what these experiences mean for the reader. I would have loved more of that kind of lesson from this. And I know that the newer editions have more of like an author's note or an epilogue about like, you know, years and years into the future, how are some of these people doing? But I was missing that in my audiobook, which was a bummer because this book came out just the year after 9/11 happened. So I think that having a more expanded epilogue would have been really, really nice, especially since it's been almost 25 years since 9/11 happened. So I definitely recommend this book. I've heard it's a play also, which is kind of interesting. So if you've heard of this story, it's probably from the play because it sounds like that's kind of how it became more popular, but I didn't know about this book. And so I really like the opportunity to get to read a fairly short nonfiction book and kind of open my eyes a little bit about that experience and just realizing that Canadians are so nice. And I mean, I already knew that. Granted, the world is different now than it was in 2001, but also I think culturally, the people of Newfoundland and Canada are very different than the people in the United States. And if a similar crisis happened nowadays and the United States was expected to accept international flights so they wouldn't have to go to Canada because Canada's airspace was locked down, I don't think that the outcome would have looked the same. 20, 25 years ago, it wouldn't have looked the same, but especially now, just the way the political climate is and where we are in the stage of the world is honestly not something I'm proud of. It just really reminded me of the stark difference in cultures between Newfoundland and Canada versus the United States. And this was a huge example of that was really humanizing to see, and I really like that. The next book that I read was Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, and I've heard great things about this book. I really like these frayed edges for this paperback that recently came out. Ooh, shiny, the foil too. I feel like this book was reminiscent of a Frederick Bachman, just very heartwarming. Just the style felt very Frederick Bachman, going through different perspectives of people, kind of seeing how all their stories kind of interact and relate to one another. And so that was familiar and kind of interesting to consider. But I feel like Frederick Bachman does it a little bit better. And I don't know if this is Shelby Van Pelt's first novel or what, but I rated this a 3.75 star. Again, things I really liked. It was heartwarming. I do tend to like multiple POVs and how things kind of are all threaded together. I find that interesting. Though I feel like the way that this story did it, I absolutely hated Cameron, which is one of the POVs. He was such a deadbeat. I was just not a fan of him. He was really immature. I just could not support him or get excited about him or like want him to succeed. I was just over him. You also get a little bit of perspective from Marcellus, who is the octopus in question. While I found his point of views interesting, I just had a little bit of a hard time suspending my disbelief enough to really get behind the idea that he was an octopus. Like sometimes I was convinced and other times I was like, would an octopus really say that if they could talk? I really don't know, but it was just a little hard to feel connected to Marcellus as a character, and his point of views were pretty short. And then our last perspective was Tova, who is this elderly lady. And in general, I really liked her perspective. She works at the aquarium. She is a housekeeper, cleaner type of person there, and she's really diligent at her job, and she starts to connect with Marcellus. So you kind of hear that more through her perspective, of course. And I did end up really liking her character. And while I like how all these characters are kind of threaded together, it felt really obvious from way early on in the story where the story was going and what secrets would come out. We just didn't get a lot of answers beyond what was very, very predictable. So that kind of fell short for me. I also feel like I just needed more closure on Eric and Devney and kind of how everything played out. Yeah, I just didn't get a lot of answers and closure beyond what I had already predicted throughout the entire book and seeing where these characters were going. I enjoyed it, but I did not enjoy it as much as I thought. I thought I would really be hooked emotionally, but I liked it. I just didn't love it. The next book that I read was The Night and the Moth, another foil cover by Rachel Gillig, and I absolutely loved her The Shepherd's King duology, and I really enjoyed that, so I was looking forward to this one. And look at these cool stenciled edges. I really love how Rachel Gillig is doing these like gothic, medieval, fantasy type stories. I'm really enjoying that like subgenre or that like niche genre, I guess. I like how the magic in this story is unique, but also approachable. Though I would say a little less approachable than the playing cards of the Shepherd's King duology. In the story, you are following Six, who is a diviner. So she drowns in these like sacred waters in order to see dreams or visions to predict and share with the world. So she's having these dreams or visions to kind of answer some questions for some people, be a diviner, a prophetess for them. Her time of serving at this like monastery type place is almost ending, and you find this out on the cover as well. The other 5 diviners start going missing, and she is trying to figure out what happened to them and what's going on. So she ends up leaving the monastery with a gargoyle companion and a couple knights, one of which is the love interest. And they are traveling around on, unbeknownst to her, another mission while she is trying to figure out what happened to the other diviners. So between her magic and other magical characters that she meets, it was a very interesting take to kind of learn about the magic of like the sacred water that she would drown in and things like that. So very interesting. I, in general, liked the relationship between her and her knight. What was his name? Roderick. I didn't quite connect with it as much as the romance in the Shepherd's King duology, but I did in general like it, and I liked the progression and growth between these characters like individually as well as together in a relationship. I read this a 4.5 stars, so not my perfect romance, but definitely pretty up there. And while there were some things that I expected that didn't quite happen or like happened but weren't quite as fulfilling as I anticipated, I still really liked where the story went and the things that we learned and how much bigger the world got when Six left the monastery area to go like see the world and figure out what happened to her other diviner sisters. There was a big twist at the end that, while I anticipated it for quite a while, we got so close to the end that I was like, I guess that won't happen. And then it did happen, which totally threw me off guard. The way that it was woven into the story definitely caught me by surprise. So I really like that, even though it was a predictable twist, for me at least, it wasn't super heavy-handed. So that was really fun. I definitely look forward to reading the next book. While I like this book, I think I like the Shepherd's King duology a little bit more. So I'm excited to see what the next book has in store and if it'll change my mind, because I enjoyed the second book of her first duology more than the first book. So we'll see if that is also true for this one. If you hear some crackling, that's my husband working on a diamond painting in the other room. So I hope it's not picking up too much. The next story I have to share is Kills Well with Others by Deanna Raybourn. This is the second book in her newest mystery series that involves some elderly women who used to be spies, basically, for an organization, and they are recently retired. In this story, the director of this organization comes back to them and invites them to help figure out what's going on with an assassin who seems to be targeting certain spies from this organization. And this director of their organization thinks that these 4 women are on the hit list, so might as well put them to work to solve the problem before it gets to them, kind of idea. I really enjoyed this book. I would say this is probably my favorite from July that I read. I rated it a 4.5 star. I liked it more than the first book, and I think it's because it just had a little bit more depth in these characters, between the flashbacks of when they were younger and just starting out in their spy careers, as well as in the present day, and seeing how these characters have grown since the previous book that was maybe like a year previously. I just felt like there was a lot of character growth and depth and nuance, and that was one thing that I wish there was more of in the first book, and so I was really happy to get it in this book. This was still really fun, and it was interesting to see how these elderly spy people would like use skills that they've learned, but also some ways that they maybe made mistakes or chose to do things that they wouldn't normally do. Maybe they're losing their touch, or maybe they're just taking creative liberties, kind of thing. So that was really interesting. This was a fun and fast-paced mystery, and there were some red herrings. There was definitely some mysteries they had to solve along the way to kind of figure out what was actually happening, because they were led astray a few times. And so it was just really interesting to follow along. It was the perfect blend of like kind of a cozy feeling mystery without actually being a cozy mystery. There was more depth in the mystery story and in the questions on what was happening, and as these characters were trying to figure out what was going on. It just, had a lot more depth than a typical cozy mystery, but definitely had cozy vibes, and I really enjoyed these characters. The next book I read was Summer Romance by Annabel Monaghan, and this was my first Annabel Monaghan book. She has quite a few shorter romances that tend to come out in the summertime, and so I thought that reading one of them, at least reading the one that was available from my library, would be a great place to start. I do have one of her books on my 25 to read in 2025 list, and that one was not available yet. I think it already came in. I think my hold came in, so I should get to it this next month. In Summer Romance, you follow Allie, who recently went through a separation and is also still grieving the loss of her mother, and she's just lost a lot of herself through these grieving times, as well as through just the process of being in a marriage that did not support and uplift her and help her to, stay true to herself. And so she meets Ethan at the dog park. Her dog pees on him. That starts a friendship / flirtationship where she comes to feel more like herself and invest more in who she was and who she wants to be in the future. And so you see a lot of character growth throughout the story, a lot of character growth, which is really nice to see. Definitely takes the forefront of the story with the romance coming in hot at like a close second with Ethan. And in general, I really liked that, though I wish there was a little bit more depth to the romance. And I think partly that's because Ethan has had a crush on her since like high school. And so it was very insta-lovey. Like he was all over her right when they first met again at this dog park. And she didn't recognize him at first for a while. So that was kind of fun. But I just wanted a little bit more depth in their relationship since it just came so easily for him. There was no tension on his side. There was no question on his side. It was just, yeah, really easy on his end. And a lot of the tension and stress and figuring things out in the book was really focused on Allie. And yeah, I just wanted a little bit more balance between her and her character growth and the relationship and the growth of the relationship. And I know that they were connected, and that makes sense. Yeah, I just felt like the balance was like not quite there for me personally, and what I was hoping to get out of it. Wanted a little bit more summer romance and swooniness, if that makes sense. I rated this a 4-star. Another reason why I didn't rate this quite as high is because this is kind of a short book, but because this book was so focused on Allie's growth that was very gradual throughout the story, it felt a little bit slower than I would have expected considering the length of the story. I also feel like the ending of the book, the conclusion, was just wrapped up really fast and really simple. And considering the whole buildup for the story kind of was pointing in the direction of the third act conflict or, you know, the third act breakup or whatever, it just felt like it resolved pretty simply and pretty easily, considering how much internal stress Allie was facing about that concern. So I don't know. Yeah, not like perfect, but I actually really like this. I would maybe even bump this up to a 4.25 star. I am really excited to read more from Annabel Monaghan, and I really hope that I continue to enjoy her works because it's always fun to find a new romance author that you can just get behind and really enjoy their things. This next book that I read was my reread for the month, and this was a classic, 1984 by George Orwell. I recently read Animal Farm for the first time, and I was thinking I really wanted to reread this book. I haven't read it since high school. I can't remember what year I read it in, but it's been almost 15 years since I've read it. And so I really wanted to reread it. In memory, I thought that this book was more applicable to what's going on in today's day and age. And while there are definitely parts that are applicable, it didn't hold quite as many parallels with modern day times as I had remembered, you know, from reading it more than a decade ago. So I think it was really good for me to revisit this book. I rated it a 3.75 star. In general, I really love the background that George Orwell puts in the world building that he puts into what's going on in this story. I love the idea of newspeak and the implications of getting rid of those meanings for words and kind of simplifying the thought and communication of the people. I just find it so fascinating. The world building is really amazing in this dystopian novel. The middle of the story was so long and boring. Part of that was because Winston, our main character, he works for the party, which is like the government, and he is internally questioning what's going on and being like, wait, but they're changing history, or, you know, I'm remembering these things that other people aren't acknowledging that happened. And so he is feeling a little dissonant with what's going on around him, but he doesn't want to get captured by the thought police and tortured and whatnot. So he's trying to keep things on the down low, and he ends up getting a copy of a book by a historically well-known rebel. And so he's reading Goldstein's book in the middle of this story, but he's like reading it out loud for like pages and pages, and it just got so old and slow and boring that I totally stalled out in the middle of this book. I do not remember that happening the first time I read it. Man, that was like really boring and hard to read. And I wish, because there's so many lines in here that really pack a punch and are really thought-provoking, like lots of really good one-liners from George Orwell. I wish that those portions of the book in the middle had been truncated to continue to give that like one-liner, hard-hitting, thought-provoking things rather than all this like exposition that kind of went over the same topics that, you know, you've already addressed a little bit and that you've probably been thinking about the whole time you've been reading this, but were not quite as explicitly stated earlier on in the book. That was like not as enjoyable. I also found that in the last part of the story, the ending was kind of devastating. and I actually really liked how it ended and the meaning behind it. This is a book that I'm going to think about some more. I think that it has a lot to say about censorship and who is controlling the narrative, though I definitely feel like this is not as closely tied with what's going on in today's political climate as I had remembered it did. And so that made me feel, I guess, maybe slightly better. Only slightly, but I still think it's definitely worth a read. A classic for a reason. Another thing is, it was written in the 40s. You can definitely tell because of the casual misogyny and racism that is kind of sprinkled throughout the story. Not a fan. I think this book is still worth a read and worth a really good discussion. And I think it was, for good reason, included in my high school's English class because there was a lot of reason to talk about what is happening in this. And a lot, like I said, a lot of thought-provoking one-liners and a lot of themes that are still pertinent to today's political climate and to censorship and kind of those topics that I think are really worth talking about. The penultimate book that I read was Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. And this is a novella, super short, like 90 pages. It was such a quick listen. And this is about a young adult girl who comes from, it definitely sounds like more of a desert tribal culture on Earth. And her people traditionally stay at home, but she gets accepted to university. And so she gets on a starship and sails away to another planet to be able to study at this renowned university. She's planning on, coming back and bringing her knowledge back with her, but she has an extensive knowledge of like mathematics and things like that. She's a very smart girl. And while she's on this starship, the starship gets attacked by this alien race, and she is trying to figure out how to navigate and stay safe while also hoping to keep people in the destination safe too, because the aliens are trying to hijack the ship kind of thing. I will say, I rated this a 4.25 star. I really enjoyed it. The world building is amazing. Like, so intricate, so engrossing. I felt like I was sucked right into the story. I just wanted more. It was too short. I needed more of the book because I could tell that there was just so much depth to this world, to these cultures, to these people, even to Binti herself and what makes her tick. And I just wanted more of all that. I could have read a full-length novel of this and I would have loved it. I just needed more of what the author gave us. And this is part of a trilogy. So I'm really excited to continue reading it. I just am a little worried that the depth and the sharing of the world building that I am really hoping for will not come in these other novellas like I'm hoping. But I really hope we get more because I can tell that it's there, and the glimpses that we got were just so deep and well thought out and complex. It just felt like I was in a different world. So well written, just a little too short and not enough. I wanted more of the story. And then my final book that I finished in the month of July, this is Expecting Better by Emily Oster, and I am expecting. Part of why I've been in a slump, though I am now in my second trimester, and I'm definitely starting to feel more like myself. So I'm hoping that the next month will be an even better month as far as reading and knitting videos and all that goes. It's exciting, and I wanted to be able to finish this book so that I could announce that I am expecting. We are excited. We'll see kind of how the rest of the year turns out as things progress and what kind of videos I can come out with. I don't know if anyone is interested in pregnancy or maternity related reading content, or if you're just hoping for some reading vlogs maybe from me, but I'm definitely planning on having some more videos coming out before the baby comes so that I can have some good content on my channel that you can look forward to when I am probably gonna take a break and not get as much done with baby around. That's exciting. This is actually a reread. I totally forgot. This is another reread for me. I read this when I was pregnant with my first child, and this has actually been updated for 2025, so perfect timing for me to read this new and improved version. Emily Oster has a few books in this realm of using her statistical knowledge, because she is a statistician, in the realm of pregnancy and motherhood and parenting and all that stuff, and applying it to these really easy to read nonfiction books. And what I really love about this book, I feel like I would rate it maybe like a 4.25 star to a 4.5 star. Not quite sure where I would place it in the end, but I really love that there's like a solid bibliography at the back, and there's also like a solid index at the back. But I love that there's this really intense bibliography. And while I would not be surprised if there's some studies missing, that she didn't capture everything that is out there in the scientific community, I really appreciate her perspective on analyzing the data that's out there and making it really easy to consume, sharing what is statistically significant versus what is not, acknowledging areas that we have a lot of research about versus areas we don't, or areas that the recommendations may be outdated based on research from like the 60s, because there's definitely not enough research in the realm of maternal and newborn care in general. I think that if you want to read this book, I would definitely recommend it for someone who is preparing to have a child or preparing to be a support system for someone having a child, that you don't take all of this as like the gospel truth. A grain of salt feels like not enough like attention to it. I do feel like this author did a really good job at going through the data and trying to figure out what it means and how to apply it to risk-based decision making, which I feel like is a really important skill, and especially when there are so many opinions about pregnancy and motherhood, that each individual parent needs to make their own risk-based decisions based on the data that's available and what their personal values are in order to like feel confident in the decisions they make. And so that's what I really recommend this for, is getting a taste of the data that's out there and the possible recommendations, and if those recommendations are still even prevalent or even a topic of consideration versus something really outdated, and then deciding based on the data available what you want to do for yourself and your pregnancy and how you are going to raise this child, kind of thing. So I think that it holds a lot of value in that sense, but it's not the only resource and it's not the end all and be all of like pregnancy knowledge. But I feel like this is a really great place to start and can give a lot of comfort and knowledge and, I don't know, like self-confidence and decisions that you can make in your own healthcare and in knowing what to address with your own personal healthcare provider about pregnancy and birth and things like that. Just knowing that you're not just at the mercy of whatever provider you choose and what they decide to share with you, but that you can have some evidence-based knowledge to kind of back up where you're coming from as you enter the conversation and participate in your own care, if that makes sense. So definitely recommend it. Not a perfect resource, but definitely a really great place to start and definitely worth a read, I would say. Some people feel very strongly that it is not worth the read, but I feel like it is, as long as you understand that it is not a perfect reference and the gospel truth about pregnancy. All right, there you have it. The 11 books that I finished in the month of July, as well as all 8 books that I read in June. So hopefully we'll catch up. I'm feeling better, so we can hopefully get back on track with our monthly reads. And I don't expect to read a lot of like pregnancy or motherhood related books, but you might see 1 or 2 things thrown in here, maybe. Again, I'm not a super nonfiction reader, so the reading content on my channel might not change very much, but I do plan on having some more knitting and crochet related content in the realm of baby, maternity, things like that. So if you're interested in hearing about the things that I'm making, the things I'm hoping to make, different pattern roundups, or vlogs related to that type of content, then definitely make sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification down below so you can be notified every time I post a new video. Because while right now I'm posting regularly but not on a consistent schedule, that will probably change after having this baby. But I do plan to still be here and still share the things that I'm reading. I may end up combining my reading and my making videos together back into the podcast if I'm not reading a ton, just so I can like keep the content fairly current. I don't know. I really don't know how it's gonna look, but let me know if you have any ideas, anything you really want to see from me, and especially if you want to see any specific reading content from me before I have this child, so that I can make sure to put that content out for you and make sure you have something to watch that you're really excited about. Thank you again for joining me for this slightly longer video as I covered these 2 months and got back on track with my reading videos. I really appreciate you being here, and until next time, happy reading. Bye!